Well, hello, anatomy and physiology class. Good to be with you guys today. Today's lecture will be taking place of the normal synchronous class that we would have on Labor Day, September 7th. So today we get to dive into the study of tissues. And so we're going to look at histology, and then we're going to look at our first true tissue. So we're moving away from the, we started, remember, at the cellular level. Moving up to we started at the chemical level, cellular, and now we're going into the tissue level. Okay, so let's do that. All right, so I just sort of gave this one away, but histology is the study of what? Histology is the study of tissues. All right, and this is just kind of another image of similar to the one that we looked at before, where we look at those different levels, right? So we can look at, oops, sorry about that. We can look at anatomy in terms of the atomic level, right, up to the molecular level, the macromolecule level, up to the organelle level, right, which then we move into the cellular level, okay, and then we move into the tissue level where those cells come together to make tissues, and that's where we're at right now, okay, and then eventually move into the organ system, organ level, organ system, finally to the organism, right, so but we are right here at the tissue level, so let's get going. So one thing I think of when I think about the tissues of the body is I think of this verse in 1 Corinthians 12:12 that says, "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ." So same idea here, the body of Christ is the church, is the people of Christ, and the body that we inhabit is a collection of many different things coming together to all produce its function, just like the church and the body of Christ. Okay, so let's start out with the definition. Definition of tissue, right? So tissue is defined as a group of cells that are similar in structure and function. Okay, they have similar anatomy and physiology, right? Structure and function. Okay, and there's four main tissue types in the human body. There's epithelial tissue. Its main job is to cover. Connective tissue. Its main job is to support. Nervous tissue. Main job to control. And muscle tissue. Main job is to produce movement. Okay, so histology is the study of these tissues. So there's really only these four tissue types in the human body. So we're going to start with epithelial tissue. Next class, we'll talk about connective tissue. And then from there, we'll dive into the musculoskeletal system, which includes both connective tissue and muscle tissue. And then finally, at the end of the semester, we'll dive into the nervous system. All right, so characteristics of tissues. When we think about how to categorize a tissue and how to kind of come up with different tissue types, one way we can do that is by cells, the cells that inhabit those tissues, okay? So the cells of each tissue have special features depending on their functions, right? So structure is intimately tied to function. Right, and the other way, function is intimately tied to structure. Okay, so the organelles. So certain cells, like skeletal muscle cells, also known as myocytes, are just packed with mitochondria. Why? Because they need to make a lot of ATP, right? They burn a lot of energy, and so we need a lot of ATP production capability, and that happens in the mitochondria, right? So we have lots of mitochondria in skeletal muscle cells. Liver cells, also known as hepatocytes. You'll notice that that site word is on the end, and that means cell. Myo means muscle, hepato means liver. Right? So you'll start noticing some similarities like that. Liver cells have a gigantic, smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Why? Because one of their main jobs is to detoxify chemicals, and that's one of the jobs of the smooth ER. Okay, what about the shape of the cell? Shape of the cells is determined by the internal structure of the cell, called the cytoskeleton. And so, for example, neurons have these incredibly long extensions on them, those axons, right? And those are used for communication because they need to reach out to other tissues to communicate with them, okay? Proteins produced are different in each cell, okay? So structural proteins like actin and myosin are made by muscle cells, okay? Functional proteins like growth hormone is made by pituitary cells, okay? We're only going to find growth hormone being produced by those pituitary cells. So we see if it's, that protein called growth hormone, see if it's being produced by a cell, then we know that's a pituitary cell, okay? So the interactions between cells is another important piece. So if we notice gap junctions between cells, okay, then that's going to tell us something. We have those between cardiac myocytes because those need to transfer signals from one to the next. Okay. We also may have tight junctions. Okay, tight junctions, cells, for example, cells lining the brain for what we call the blood-brain barrier. Okay, that blood-brain barrier is an important piece to keeping the brain healthy, keeping things out of the brain that aren't supposed to be in the brain. Okay, we also can look at a tissue not just by looking at its cells within, but we can also look at the space outside of the cells, which is called the extracellular matrix. Okay, so that's all of the space around cells. Okay, every cell is in contact with fluid in a tissue. Okay, and that fluid is called the interstitial fluid. Okay, and the space is called the interstitial space. All right, we've already talked about that a little bit because that's where the swelling was when we talked about an ankle sprain, right? So when we have fluid buildup in the interstitial space or excess interstitial fluid, and that's known as swelling or edema. Okay, and this ranges drastically. It can be super liquidy, like the blood, okay, or it can be hard as rock, like the bone. Okay, those are both different tissues of the body. And so the functions of that extracellular matrix are, number one, to keep the tissue moist, to protect that tissue, and help to hold cells together. So the contents of the extracellular matrix are typically different types of protein. Collagen is the most common one that we'll find. We also have polysaccharides, water, and salts. Okay, these polysaccharides are important for holding on to fluid. Okay, so that's kind of just a general basics about histology and about tissues. Now let's dive into our first tissue that we're going to study, which is called epithelial tissue. And there's really two different broad categories of epithelial tissue. Number one, or sorry, they're called the number one type is the covering and lining type. Okay, so think of the outer layer of our skin, the lining of our intestine, our body cavities, blood vessels, etc. The second type is the glandular type. So glands, things that are producing things to be released and releasing them either into the body or out of the body. Okay, so all epithelial tissue has some special characteristics to it. And so let's walk through those special characteristics. You'll definitely need to know these characteristics. So number one, the cells are tightly packed. Okay, there's almost no extracellular space. It's almost all cells. Okay, this makes sense for a tissue that's supposed to be lining and protecting and keeping things out, right? Everything must pass through the cells, not in between the cells. So we really have these continuous sheets of cells. Okay, it's common to see desmosomes and tight junctions holding these cells together to keep a tight seal. Okay, so obviously this makes for good lining, a barrier, a seal. Okay, special characteristic number two of epithelial tissue. The cells are polar. That doesn't mean the same thing as like a water molecule where it's positive on one side and negative on the other side, but it does mean that they're just two distinct sides. Okay, one side looks very different than the other. Okay, so the first side is called the apical side, also known as the free side. We see that up here. Okay, see that apical side. This is the side that's going to be inside of the cavity that, or the space that it's protecting. This is kind of on the outside. Okay, so yeah, so the outside. So for example, this is the outside of our skin. This is the internal part of our digestive tract where the food is actually going through, right? Inside of our respiratory tract where the air is going through. So it's kind of more external in a way. But when you think about it in terms of the digestive tract, it's more internal, but it's really just the open side, the side that's open to the air or side that's open to the fluid passing through, okay? Or it could be the inside of the gland. We often see microvilli here, and this helps to increase the surface area. And for example, in the intestines, we have these special enzymes called brush border enzymes, and those enzymes are there to help us break down food. And so the more of those microvilli we have, the more space we have to plug in those little brush border enzymes and to create the reactions that we need to break down that food, okay? Also, some have cilia, okay? The Y on that is because that helps to move things. So in our respiratory tract, right, we catch that dust, cilia moves the mucus up so we can get rid of it, okay? So that's the apical side. That's all up here, okay? And then the other side is called the basal surface, okay? And this is the side that kind of anchors those cells to the rest of the body, right? So it attaches the cells. we see that here. So it's also known as the basement membrane is a part of it. So we see the basal surface of the cell, which is just going to be this part, but then we have the basal membrane right below that, which is made up of the basal lamina, which is considered part of the epithelial tissue. But then we have the reticular lamina, which is actually part of the connective tissue below it. Okay, we can see that here. So that basal membrane includes basal lamina, which is epithelial tissue, and then also the reticular lamina, which is not part of the epithelial tissue. It's part of the connective tissue that anchors the epithelial tissue in place. Okay, and that leads us right to special characteristic number 3, which is that all epithelial tissue is supported by connective tissue. Okay, so all epithelium rests on a connective tissue layer. Okay, so just underneath that basal lamina is the reticular lamina, like we just said, and those are fine collagen fibers that support this large network of connective tissue. Okay, and so again, the basal lamina plus the reticular lamina, that equals our basement membrane. Okay, characteristic number 4 is that epithelial tissue is avascular, means it doesn't have blood vessels, but it is innervated, which means that the nervous system does interact with it. And then lastly, our 5th special characteristic is that it's highly proliferative. It regenerates a lot. What that means is the cells are growing a lot, constantly replacing themselves. Just think about your skin, right? You have lots of layers of dead skin cells on top. Those are constantly falling off. And then the layer at the bottom is making new ones, and they're pushing its way up. And so we're constantly regenerating cells because the cells are getting destroyed a lot because they're in places that are under high friction, high impact type areas. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So the review question here, the special / defining characteristics of epithelial tissue include all of the following except for, so pause it for a second, see if you can answer this question. Okay, so hopefully you answered that. So always supported by connective tissue, we know that one was right. Blood vessels found here, but no nerves. Okay, is that true? Let's see. Have an apical side and a basal side. Yes. They're also always very tightly packed. Yep. They usually have many desmosomes. Yep, we talked about that. But so it's this one, right? It does not have blood vessels. No, it has no blood vessels, but yes on the nerves. Okay. All right, so let's look at some specific types and how we actually classify epithelial tissue. Okay. So the classification criteria include how many layers of cells we have. Okay, so it can be simple, which just means one layer. It can be stratified, which means multiple layers, or it can be something in between called pseudo-stratified, where it looks like it's multiple layers, but it's actually not. Okay, so why don't you take a second and see if you can label which one is which. Okay, so stop and do that. And then I would, if we were in class, I would have you answer this question of those 3, A, B, or C, which one is pseudo-stratified. Okay, so pause it for a sec, see if you can match those up. Okay, so let's take a look. So B here is obviously the simple. Okay, so we see that it's just one layer of cells all touching the basal surface. Okay, then we kind of have these 2 other ones here, A and C. With C, we see there's definitely multiple layers of cells on top of each other because we can see those different nuclei. So that is definitely our stratified. C is our stratified. And the pseudo-stratified is a little bit tricky. It almost looks like there's multiple layers. And you can see those ones are all touching. There's some here that don't seem to touch, but they actually just go behind the other one. You can't see where it is. And that would be the pseudo-stratified one. Okay. All right, so the second way that we classify epithelial tissue is by the shape of the cell. Okay, so the cells can be either flat, which we would call them squamous. Okay, they can be cube shaped, which we would call them cuboidal, or they can be tall and thin, and we would call them columnar. Okay, so you can match those up. Right, which one is squamous there? The question will be this one, right? A. Okay, so cell shape, A for squamous, B for cuboidal, and C for columnar. Okay, so now we're going to get into some images of what this tissue, what these different types of tissue actually look like, and you'll need to visually identify those. And you also need to verbally identify them, meaning that you'll need to know their functions, the examples of places that I say that you can find them. Okay, so you'll need to visually identify both the drawing and photograph. Don't necessarily depend on getting a color picture. Okay, and then you only have to know in as much detail as is given in class. Okay, And there's many other locations of each tissue found in the book, okay? But you don't need to know those. You just need to know the examples of tissue that I give you, of where those tissues are that I give you right here in class. Okay. All right, so the first one, simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so the characteristics of it is kind of often hexagonal in shape, obviously a single layer, and they're flat. Okay, they're so flat that the nucleus is actually the thickest part and it appears like a little bump. Okay, so the functions of these allow for things to diffuse through rapidly and filter as well. Okay, because they're so thin, things can go right through. All right, so this is what we find lining our blood vessels and our lymph vessels, lining the alveoli, which are the little sacs of air in the very bottom of our lungs where we need to diffuse oxygen and CO2 directly through. And also our mesothelium, which is the serous membrane in our thoracic cavity. Okay, this is what simple squamous looks like. You see it there, you see those individual cell shapes with each little nucleus. And these are from an alveoli, which is the bottom of your lungs right here. Okay, that's one example. Okay. So then the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, again, single layer because it's simple, cuboidal shaped there. And this looks really like a string of beads when you have a cross section. I'll show you one of those in a sec. Some of these have microvilli or cilia, others don't. Their main jobs are to secrete things, which means send things out of cells, out of the body, like in the kidneys when we want to remove things like too much hydrogen ions, okay? Or absorb things, and that would be bring things in. So we also see these in the kidneys. So we see these in our glands, and then we see these in the tubules that go through our kidneys. Okay, so here's an example from the kidneys. This would be a cross section, and so it kind of looks like this little string of beads, right? This is actually where the urine is passing through, and things that need to be pulled out of the urine will get pulled in that way. That would be the absorption. Things that need to get entered into the urine so we can get rid of it, waste products, are going to be pushed in that way. That would be the secretion part. Okay, so that's like taking a single tube and cutting it down the center so we can see those cells. Okay, but then if we take there's a bunch of little tubes sticking down, right, and we slice it this way, then that's what that picture on the right is looking at. Okay, so we can see one tube there, the urine is in the middle of these. Okay, and then we can see those cells lining those. So it's simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Okay, there's another shot of that, looking at multiple tubes there, right? So we can see where the urine is passing through in there. Okay, then we've also got simple columnar epithelial tissue. Again, so simple because it's one layer, right? Columnar is the shape, okay? Columnar shaped cells. Most of them have microvilli and cilia, okay? The functions again are the same, secretion and absorption. We find these lining our gastrointestinal tracts of our stomach and our intestines. And then we find these in glands as well. So here's what we got. Here it is in the small intestine. So those cells are nice and tall, single layered, okay? We can see that basement membrane there clearly, okay? And then this is the open area where the food would be passing through. Okay, we can also see something here, special cells that we typically find in this area called goblet cells. Goblet cells are mucus producing cells. They're going to be releasing mucus into the digestive tract, okay? Again, we see it in the stomach here as well. And we can see those little microvilli there. Okay, so simple columnar epithelial tissue, again, typically we see goblet cells like this. And so those goblet cells are releasing mucus into the digestive tract, okay? All right, and then the next one here is called pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay, so again, it's one layer, but it looks like more. Those, we have columns, but they're not all the same height, right? Some are taller than others, some kind of pass back behind others. The functions of these would be trapping and removing particles. We find plenty of these in the respiratory tract, okay? And these typically have cilia like this. Okay, so they're pseudostratified columnar. So we can see those columnar shaped cells, but they're a little bit less uniform. And we see this hairy-like stuff, which is really the cilia. Okay, next one is called stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, so the characteristics are definitely have multiple layers. They look a little bit more cuboidal at the bottom. flatter, and then they get flatter as they go to the top, because as those skin cells go to the top, all of their organelles are removed and they're just replaced with protein, a protein called keratin. Okay, and there's really two different types. There's the moist type of this tissue, and then there's the keratinized tissue. Okay, functions of this are really just for resisting wear and tear and protecting against foreign invaders. Okay, so the moist type we find in the mouth, throat, larynx, esophagus, so all of our respiratory and digestive tracts, at least going in. Find these in the lining of the anus, urethra, as well as the vagina. Okay, and then the keratinized is the skin. Okay, so let's take a look at that. This is an example of stratified squamous epithelium lining of the esophagus. So this is a moist type. So you can see those nuclei here are all stacked on top of each other. So multiple layers there of tissue. Okay, and this is an example of the skin. And really we're talking about this top part up here. We'll talk more about these other layers down here later, but that top part is our epithelial tissue, simple stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, and then the next one is called transitional epithelium. This one is different because it is definitely multiple layers. So it would be stratified, but that's not part of the name. They look cuboidal when the tissue is relaxed, but then they flatten out when it's stretched. And so the main function of these is to be able to stretch. We find these in the bladder and the ureter. So when your bladder fills up, these stretch out, those cells flatten, and that gives the tissue the ability to stretch. Okay, so we can see that with an empty bladder here. Okay, that's this one versus a full bladder right here, right? So cube-shaped cells, and then these are more flat-shaped cells now as it gets stretched out. Okay, and that's kind of the basics of those tissue types in the epithelium, and that's the lining and covering portion. Now we're going to transition to talk about the glandular part of the epithelium. Okay, so the epithelium, again, the covering part, we just did that, right? But what about the glandular part? Okay, so the glandular part, its general features are to manufacture and secrete materials. Okay, the materials that it secretes are typically water-based, polar fluid with some proteins in there, or it can just be simply chemicals. Okay, we'll talk about a couple of those. So one or more cells. So if it's a big gland like this, then it's a multicellular gland, right? But it can also just be a single cellular gland, like those goblet cells we just looked at that are releasing mucus. Okay, so endocrine glands. So within those types of glands, there's different types. There's endocrine and exocrine, right? So endocrine means that we're secreting into the body, right? So this is primarily for communication, right? These are our hormones, our endocrine system. We'll talk about this a lot more next semester, okay? These types of glands are ductless, meaning that there's no special little tube that takes the things that it releases up to the blood. There's actually just cells, and those cells release the hormones via exocytosis, okay? And it releases right into the extracellular space. All right, so it's going to be released here, make its way into a blood vessel, and then it can travel down the blood vessel and communicate with the rest of the body. Okay, and so there's two types, the multicellular organ, which is what we typically think of, like the pancreas, the thyroid gland, pituitary gland. Those are multicellular organs of the endocrine system. Okay, but then we also have what's known as the diffuse endocrine system, which this is just cells scattered all over the body, and it can be just normal cells, actually, like fat cells, like adipocytes or stomach cells, and they release special hormones that are important for different functions of the body. Okay, exocrine glands on the other side of things, these are secreting, outside of the body. Okay, so they either secrete onto the body's surface, which might be our skin, right? Or we have to also kind of understand that outside of the body actually can mean, it can actually mean into our digestive tract, into our GI tract, okay? So if something's released into our digestive tract or into our reproductive tract, then that's considered outside of the body, and that's an exocrine gland, okay? So that's usually released in some kind of a solution that contains proteins that kind of give it a mucousy, thick effect, okay? So unicellular exocrine glands, We have some of those, and those are those goblet cells we just talked about. Okay, those can produce what's called mucin. Okay, and mucin is a glycoprotein, so a protein with some carbohydrates on it, right? And so when that interacts with water, it dissolves and turns into mucus. Okay, then what about multicellular exocrine glands? Okay, there's two main types of ways that they secrete their secretions. Okay, so we have glands like this, the many cells that line the whole gland. Okay, and there's two different ways that they can secrete. Okay, merocrine means that they secrete via exocytosis, so the cells within that gland release things via exocytosis. Okay, this is really how most of our sweat glands work. But then we also have holocrine glands, which literally means one of the cells that are lining that gland just falls out, and it's the whole cell that is the secretion. These tend to be more oily, sebaceous oil glands, and the secretions are much more oily. Okay, so which one's which there? Once you pause it for a second, look at those pictures, see if you can figure out which one is which. Okay, so merocrine ones are A, because we see exocytosis happening, right? And then the holocrine ones, we see full-on cells leaving here, right? So this one is B. All right, guys, that wraps up endothelial tissue. We'll see you soon.